Okay, thanks for joining. I'm Rob Gould from Barker, and we help clients across the education industry manage their estates and capital projects effectively. And welcome to this session, part of the MSc 21 Summit. I'm going to kick off today's session with a few thoughts on creating the estate's vision and how that fits into the overall estate strategy. I'm then going to hand over to colleague Jonathan Coyles from EO Consulting, and he's going to talk a bit about the use of data and technology in its usage both at a practical level within our estates functions, but also a strategic level to help provide evidence on the impact of investment decisions and facilitating strategic estates management decision making. So I hope this is a useful session. Please do submit questions during the session using the Q&A feature, and we'll try and answer those as best we can, either directly after in the Q&A or during the session afterwards. So if you're not familiar with Barker, we are property consultants, architects and surveyors specialising in the education industry for over 30 years now. And we work with schools, academies, trusts, universities and colleges in both the state funding and the independent sector, from everything from condition surveys through to delivery of capital projects. And our bread and butter is delivering capital projects from the £50,000 to £10 million range, but also more and more we're being asked to provide strategic advice to trusts and organisations as they grow and expand, and how to access funding, how to improve their energy strategies. And we also work with some of the leading independent schools and universities in exactly those sort of areas. We're the Confederation of School Trusts Platinum Partner for Property Consultancy, and also heavily involved with the Trust Network, who's also supporting this conference. And I'd say, before we get into the main body of the presentation, if you are a trust and you're not a member of the Confederation of School Trusts or TTN, it's well worth a look at their websites, because certainly in the last 12 months during the COVID crisis, it's been a perfect example of when being a part of a larger organisation can really benefit your organisations in terms of knowledge sharing and best practice, and just having a sounding board to discuss some of the day-to-day issues of running your estates and your organisations. When we approach estates management strategy or any other challenge, we quite often look at it in this way as a journey, right? So we look at where we are, where we want to go, and how we're going to get there, and that seems logical enough. The problem is that we often then get bogged down in the first stage, that we often then miss the bigger picture and fail to take those bigger, more important strategic decisions that will have the biggest impact. So as an example, we think, right, we need to get a situation report here. We're going to collect condition survey data of all of our schools. Great, we're going to get compliance audits to see where we are against our legal and statutory obligations, and that's good. We might need to get some net capacity assessments to consider our capacity and suitability, sufficiency of our estates, and it's all brilliant, vital information. But then what happens? Actually, the survey then throws up that you've got a leaking roof or a boiler that's about to fail. Or the compliance audit shows that you've got fire risk assessments that need to be carried out, or there's some urgent work that needs to be done in half of your schools. And before you know it, you're off doing these important and urgent tasks, but it's actually sidetracked you away from the really important job of stepping back and establishing the vision and the strategy and why you're doing it in the first place. I'm just going to ask you to look at things slightly differently, and that is to put the estate's vision first. It's March, we're 3 months into the year, and just as an aside, wonder how many of you made a New Year's resolution. The calendar is completely arbitrary, but every year we decide that on the 1st of January we're going to make these resolutions about how we're going to change the way we manage our personal lives, for example. I'll give you a statistic. 85% of people have given up their New Year's resolution by the second week in February. And why is that? Why do we fail? It's because our resolutions are nothing of the sort. They're just a wish list. You're not actually resolving anything. So change is inevitable. Progress is not inevitable. And it's no use making resolutions, it's making progress that's important. Progress is improvement, progress is satisfaction. If you can create a compelling vision of what excites you, what motivates you, and what engages your team, that is what will help drive you towards a decisive action and make the biggest step changes in the way that you manage your estates. So you might be asking, well, how does this tie into estates management? Well, according to the Department for Education, very, very closely indeed. This slide is from the DFE, Good Estates Management for Schools guidance, and it clearly puts the vision at the top of the tree. And importantly, this is not just the estates vision, this is the education vision for the whole trust. We've got to remember that we're asking ourselves, where is the organisation headed? As an estates function, we're just an enabler. So we are just there to help deliver the education vision and a vision of the trust at an operational level. But if you can get buy-in from others in your organisation and together create this vision for your school or your college or university or trust, that's when the good things start to happen. That's when you can get on this virtuous cycle of continuous improvement, fundraising, saving money, investing in the future that will help you move from a sort of firefighting reactive approach to making real steps forward. So what is the estates vision and how do you create one? Well, your estates vision should set out your ambition for the estate over perhaps a longer period of time than you would normally consider in your day-to-day operations. So 5 to 10 years would be typical. And it's going to describe how your estates are going to support the educational vision and the strategy of your organisation. So it needs to be prepared collaboratively, not just with people directly involved in the running of your estates, but with senior leaders and stakeholders across the whole organisation. So the estate strategy, that's something we're probably more familiar with working on our day-to-day, in our day-to-day jobs. Something we're more familiar is how we're going to actually achieve this vision. And then asset management planning sits below that still and is more of the detail and the operational framework around which you perform your daily functions. So what does an estates vision look like? Well, there's no set formula, as you can probably expect, and no template for an estates vision. It's really important, as I said, to make sure that it's developed with key stakeholders across the organisation, and it reflects the personality and the individual aims and aspirations of your organisation. So it's not a one-size-fits-all opportunity. Having said that, I've seen several estates visions across a number of organisations that I've worked with, and they tend to concentrate on one of these sort of three areas. Firstly, and it could obviously be a blend of all of these as well, just to give you an idea of some of the areas you might want to probe when developing your estates vision. So the first one is outcomes, and that is words around what you're actually trying to achieve as a trust and how that's reflected in your estates. So an example might be to create a safe and compliant and effective learning environment. It may be to create a sustainable environment, one that's minimising its impact on the environment and is minimising costs. It could be to create an efficient and effective organisational structure that enables resources to be most effectively deployed into the front line where they're going to have the biggest impact on learning outcomes. And it could even have things like a vision of innovation and trying to make sure that the organisation embodies forward thinking and review and thoughts on those lines. And with this, it's really important, if you're going to take this sort of outcomes approach, very important to have something personal to the organisation, for it not to be too generic, because a lot of these outcome wishes are going to be exactly the same for every organisation. Who doesn't want a safe and compliant and efficient and sustainable environment? So you need to try and find something that directs your vision and gives it some personality, what motivates the organisation, what makes it different, and what is specific to your trust or school. The second area that sometimes the vision can be focused around is on process, and that's very much around committing to having in place some of the building blocks around which you can create an effective estate strategy going forward. So an example of some of the things that might be contained in that sort of vision statement might be to have a strategy and to make sure that it's reviewed regularly in a systematic way. It might be to accurately record and monitor data across the estates in an effective way to facilitate quality decision making, and that's something that Jonathan will be talking about a bit more later on. And also just to maybe to maintain the sufficient amount of knowledge of the estate that's going to enable that decision making. So maintaining a comprehensive suite of condition survey data, compliance data, and all the sort of benchmarking, performance benchmarking data that's going to enable the trust or academy leaders to be making the most effective decisions. And so with this approach, it's really important to have something that's also a bit inspirational or aspirational. Try not to make it too dry and process and data driven, because we've got to remember constantly that this is the vision, this is the bit that's meant to motivate and inspire people to drive their estates forward on the strategic level. So maybe adding something along the lines of what the effects of some of these processes or decisions might actually have in terms of delivering better learning outcomes or educational objectives, just to make that sort of type of process vision a little bit more engaging. Finally, the other one I've seen a bit of in some trusts is to hang some very specific sort of performance targets around the vision. Personally, I think this can very easily stray into the estate strategy element, and so we need to be really careful about making sure that we retain that inspirational visionary element. But some trusts and academies have in their estates vision very specific objectives, such as making sure that all of their buildings are at condition B2 or better, that their utilities costs are maybe benchmarked against a figure, say £50 per pupil, or that all their buildings have got their key statutory compliance data in check, up to date and done to the required standard, or even down to things like timescales of responsiveness to maintenance or teaching days lost due to the buildings that are being used for education and teaching. So they can be very specific. As I say, just need to be a bit careful sometimes about making those too specific and straying into the strategy piece. So there's no right way of doing it, but hopefully this just gives you a bit of a flavour of some of the areas in which you might want to develop when looking at your estate's vision. And going back to the GEMS flowchart, that's what's really important. And what's also important alongside the vision is the final part of that flowchart, which is the review, the strategic review. In our day-to-day jobs, we very easily get bogged down in the nitty-gritty of strategic planning, not so much the planning, but of the operational elements of our jobs. And sometimes what we really need is the bookends of this vision and this review to make sure that we're constantly on the right journey in the longer term. And I know it all sounds quite easy and it can be a bit glib, some of this vision stuff, but actually the impact it can have on your estates can be quite significant, even if they are quite small incremental improvements. Often very much our schools are looking, like very tired 1960s buildings, acres of flat roofs, failing boilers. We know that budgets are tight and are always insufficient to do what we'd like to do across our estates. But that doesn't need to be a barrier to doing anything. If you look at the opportunities there are for achieving capital funding through saving money, particularly in the sustainability and energy efficiency spheres, and in terms of some of the procurement and financing opportunities that are available. By doing that, if you look at this school, for example, some windows replaced through Condition Improvement Fund application, roofs replaced through capital funding grants, but then those roofs then incorporating solar panels, which then gave both a saving on utilities costs, but also generated a legacy income that could then be reinvested to pump prime a better quality of data collection across the estates, new boilers, which meant that rather than wasting money on cyclical maintenance, that could be invested in some building management systems, sensors and technologies that really, again, improve the efficiency of the estate. And then just at one single school level, you're suddenly onto this virtuous cycle of continuous improvement. And if you magnify that across a larger organisation with 10, 15, 20, 40 or more sites, the benefits can be absolutely enormous. I'm now going to hand over to Jonathan Coyles, who's going to talk a bit more in depth about the way that we actually use data across our estates for making strategic decisions, and how that can be used as a proof of concept as well, to help perhaps non-estates people understand our buildings and how they impact on our educational objectives. At the end, there's going to be a Q&A, so I just encourage you to, again, please add some questions to the facility, and we'll do our best to add those on the live Q&A at the end of this session. Over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Rob, for providing that insight. We're now going to go and look in a little bit more detail on how we make your data useful. There's a whole range of data that you collect in the education sector, and part of what we want to look at is how do you make that useful and make some evidence-based decisions. Each time you look at this, there's a whole range of data that you could be collecting, be that financial data, estates data, condition data, energy data, compliance data, the CDC data that you get from the Department for Education. How does all that fit together and work for you on a daily basis? You also have to think about, before you go and collect the data, what you're actually going to do with it. If you're going to collect data that you're not going to use for 12, 18 months, why are you collecting it now? Why not wait until it's a more appropriate time to collect that data? And you really want to be spending more time analysing the data than you are collecting it. If you're spending too much time collecting it and it sits on a shelf or sits on a computer file somewhere and then it doesn't get used, then really you need to think why you're collecting that data. And the whole purpose of collecting the data is to look at how you're going to improve your estate, plan for the future, and make actionable plans that can really make a difference. And what we've done and supported a number of trusts on is going along that journey and really trying to understand what data they want to collect and how they're going to use it in the long term. So we start with condition, and obviously condition is a real challenge for every trust, whether that's a new building that you've just received through the DfE's building programmes, or it's a building that you've been looking after for the last 10, 15 years. There's a whole range of different challenges. It's planning how you're going to make those changes and how you're going to sustain the building in the long term. What we've been doing when we've collected a lot of condition data is been trying to understand that funding gap and trying to understand how the life cycle budget that you have works in the long term. Many of you are on SCA, or you'll have SIF, or you'll have local authority support into your schools. And part of what we wanted to try and do is understand where you are today and where you want to be in 10 years' time. The illustration here is showing you that gap between what you'll be receiving on a school condition allocation and what you'll be receiving, what you actually need to spend on an annual basis. And you can see that there's a shortfall in this illustration. And part of what you need to do is, how are you going to fund that funding gap? Is it that you know in 3 or 4 years' time there's going to be a new building coming along as part of a building programme? Is it that a lot of that is around electrical infrastructure, and LED lighting, for example, could be used to replace all your lighting, and that could be funded through a SAIL-X loan? Could that apply to insulation and all of those sort of things? And we've looked at that, and back in 2017 we worked with Ormiston and Brook Western on a project called the Mat Loan Pilot, which saw them invest £2.8 million in LED lighting and PV, which has helped to look at the long-term position for the trusts in reducing their carbon footprint, but also it's invested in the condition of their estate. They had huge chunks of money in their budgets needed to be replaced over the 5 years from 2017 to 2022 on LED lighting, or lighting replacement, should I say, and that would allow them to make plans to reduce that funding gap. So looking at compliance is a journey with constant change, and making that data visible and understandable by head teachers and principals, site teams, business managers, is an art. And what we're trying to look at is how you think about that in the long term. Are you using the right tools? Are you using the right solutions? We've seen the likes of Google and Microsoft invest huge amounts of money in document management over recent years through Office 365 and Google Docs, and it's starting to understand, well, are they tools that actually you can use to manage compliance documentation and bring that data to a more accessible way for staff who may not know how to use proprietary software. And so bringing in compliance and making it very visual, again, the red, amber, green ratings, giving sight and trust-wide views in the academic sector, linking that into the good estates management principles that the DFE roll out, and starting to look as technology develops of whether or not there's better ways of doing that. Do you need to use a form? Do you need to use a piece of paper? Or are there things like Microsoft Forms? Or are you getting to the point where you can deploy IoT technology to monitor Legionella temperature checks or water temperature? Are you using it to monitor when the fire alarm is being activated for the weekly checks? So you're not filling in a form each week, but you're picking up that data on a more real-time basis. What we've been trying to look at is we understand the big picture. We understand that there's hundreds of millions of pounds being spent each year on energy in the school sector, and that continues to happen and it continues to grow as energy price inflation comes into play. But what we're trying to look at here, joining you with the condition data conversation earlier, is how you can look at investing your energy budget into the condition of your estate. We have seen that 50% of the energy spend is when there are no young people in the building. We've seen that it's very easy by looking at LED and PV to reduce your energy consumption by around about 50%. And that money can then be reinvested into the estate in the long term. So it's a journey we're all on together, and we've seen through the public sector decarbonisation scheme in the last few months that there is a real drive from government to change how we use energy, not just around electricity but around heat, and that's a bigger challenge for us all. But not all energy reduction schemes require substantial investment. We've seen over the last 12 months where schools have made real savings by just understanding what was switched on and switching it off because of the lockdown periods. We've seen schools reducing their normal winter month energy consumption patterns to below what they were consuming in a normal August. So there's things that can be done there that would help to better understand and better reduce your carbon footprint. But some programs do require large capital investment, and whether that's using SCA to put LED lighting into schools and improve the thermal performance of buildings, whether that's public sector decarbonisation money where we've secured substantial chunks of money in recent months to invest in real programs for change in over 40 or so academies, then that's a really exciting program of funding. But it's not going to go away, and we've got to start to think to the future, start to put strategic plans in place that will help decarbonise your estate and help address this 50% of the energy that's spent when there's no young people in the building. We've seen from the last few slides there's a whole range of complex issues around data, and I think one of the biggest challenges that we face in the education sector is making the data engaging and useful. I think part of what we've been trying to look at over recent years, working with clients, is how do you democratise the data? How do you make it usable? How do you make it accessible? We don't want to be collecting data that sits on the shelf. We don't want to be collecting data that sits in a server or that actually is too complex for anybody to understand. And part of looking at this visual here is that we want to make it so it's fairly clear how that data is broken down and how that data can be interrogated. And partly trying to understand how that £20 million that's highlighted here is broken down into stuff that really makes a difference in the front line of an operational pattern of a school. We want to make it so the head teacher understands it, that the finance team understand it, the trustees and the governors understand it, because then we can all buy into that vision that Rob has touched on at the start. Look at delivering the strategy, making the data actionable. If the data sits there and doesn't get used, then don't collect the data in the first place. And really we're wanting people to go on a journey and understand what that data can really do and how that data can really impact young people's lives. That's all from me. Rob and I are now going to be available for the next 10-15 minutes on our live Q&A session. So please do ask us some questions, and if we can't answer them all now, we'll clearly come back to you afterwards.